My son Mark had invited me to what he called a reconciliation dinner. I was driving to see him with a fragile hope blooming in my chest. But a sudden call from my lawyer, Mr. Peterson, shattered that fragile peace entirely. "Call me the moment you get this, Eleanor. It's about your son." What he told me next would break my heart into a million pieces. The front door slammed shut with a force that sent a tremor through the house, making my teacup rattle loudly against its saucer. A moment later, heavy, deliberate footsteps thundered across my porch, angry steps that made the old wooden boards groan in protest. I barely had time to set down my evening novel before Mark burst through my front door without even a hint of a knock. "Mom, I need money, and I need it now. You have to sell this old house and give me my share." There was no hello, no apology for storming into my home. Just these raw, aggressive demands, delivered with a kind of frightening desperation I had never seen in my son before. His face was flushed a deep red, and his expensive designer suit was wrinkled, as if he had spent hours pacing in his car, working up the nerve for this confrontation. I rose slowly from my reading chair, gesturing toward the kitchen with as much maternal calm as I could summon. "Mark, you look terribly upset. Let me make you some tea, and we can—" "I don't want your damn tea," he shouted, sweeping his arm dismissively. He nearly knocked over the lamp on my side table. "I want answers. I want what's rightfully mine." "Your share?" The words came out sharper than I'd intended. My hands trembled slightly as I gripped the back of my chair for support. "This is my house, Mark. Your father and I worked our entire lives for this home." He let out a laugh, but it was a bitter, hollow sound that seemed to bounce off the living room walls. "You're going to pass on soon anyway. What do you possibly need this huge house for?" The cruelty of those words struck me like a physical blow. This was my son, the little boy whose bicycle I had held steady in this very driveway as he learned to ride. The young man I had watched with tears of pride as he stood at the altar on his wedding day. Now, he was standing in my home, my sanctuary, essentially telling me I was already as good as dead. "Mark," I started, my voice trembling as I tried to find some trace of the son I had raised. But he cut me off. He slammed his fist down on my coffee table with such force that the wooden surface jumped. "You're being selfish. Jessica and I have expenses you can't even begin to imagine. We have real problems, not like you, just sitting here reading books all day, like some useless old woman. Get out." The words left my mouth in a quiet whisper, but they carried a weight of absolute finality. Mark stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open in disbelief. I said, "Get out of my house." I pointed a steady finger toward the door, my entire body shaking with a rage that was building in my chest. "And don't you ever dare to set foot on my property again." For a second, Mark looked genuinely shocked. Perhaps he had expected me to crumble, to just hand over my life's work without putting up a fight. His expression shifted rapidly through confusion, then to anger, and finally settled on something much darker. "You'll regret this, old woman." He turned toward the door, then spun back to face me one last time. "When you're lying all alone in some miserable nursing home, I want you to remember that you chose this." The door slammed behind him with even more violence than when he had arrived. Through my front window, I watched him stomp to his sleek black sedan, rev the engine aggressively, and tear out of my driveway, leaving dark rubber marks on the concrete I had just redone. I stood there in the ringing silence, my heart hammering against my ribs. The house felt different now, as if it had been contaminated by the poison Mark had brought inside. Outside, the warm Pennsylvania evening was settling into dusk, and the streetlights were beginning to flicker on along Oakwood Avenue. My legs felt weak, so I sank back into my reading chair. The novel lay scattered on the floor where I dropped it. The tea in my cup had gone cold. I walked to the front door and slid the deadbolt into place, something I rarely did. Tonight, however, felt different. My fingers lingered on the cool metal as I tried to process what had just unfolded in my own living room. The silence in the house felt heavy and oppressive. I moved through the room slowly, my slippers shuffling against the hardwood floors that my late husband, Richard, and I had refinished together nearly 20 years ago. Everything looked the same as it had just an hour before. Yet somehow, nothing felt familiar anymore. I stopped at the mantelpiece above the fireplace, where our family photographs stood in a neat, chronological row. Mark's high school graduation picture smiled back at me. Him in his cap and gown with that proud expression he had when he was accepted to Penn State. I had worked double shifts at the architectural firm for 3 straight months to pay for his first semester's tuition. My fingers traced the cool silver frame. 42 years. I gave him everything. College. Completely on my dime. His first car. Help with the down payment. When he and Jessica bought their first house. The words hung in the empty air. I picked up another photo. It was from Mark's wedding day. His arm wrapped around Jessica. Both of them glowing with a happiness I had helped pay for. I'd contributed half the cost of that wedding. 20. 0. I had carefully saved for my own retirement, which I gladly handed over, because I wanted my only son to have the perfect day. Moving back to my reading chair, I settled into the worn leather cushions that had molded to my body over the years. This chair had been Richard's last Christmas gift to me before the cancer took him. He had saved up for months, buying it piece by piece on layaway from the furniture store downtown. I reached for the framed photo on the side table Richard and me, on our 35th anniversary, just 2 years before he passed. His hair was still thick, with just a touch of gray at the temples, and his smile was so genuine and warm. "Oh, Richard," I whispered, "if you could only see what our son has become." But had I missed the signs? I tried to pinpoint when Mark had started to change. Was it after Richard died? Or had the transformation been so gradual that I had simply refused to see it? I started calculating in my head, a habit from my days as an accountant. Mark's college education, 80, 0 total. His wedding, my 20, 0 contribution. The down payment loan for his first house that he conveniently never paid back, another 30, 0. The business loan when he started his consulting firm, a staggering 50, 0. And then there were the various emergencies, car repairs, surprise bills, lavish birthday gifts, and Christmas presents. The number just kept climbing. Over the past 2 decades, I had given Mark well over 250, 0. Not loans, but gifts. Money I had handed over freely because he was my son, because I loved him, and because I wanted to see him succeed. And tonight, he had stood in this very room, demanding more. Not asking, demanding. As if my life's work, my home, my security meant nothing compared to whatever financial hole he had dug for himself. I thought I had raised a decent man. Where did I go so wrong? The question echoed in my mind as I sat there in the deepening darkness. Outside, the neighborhood was settling into its familiar evening routine. I could hear the Petersons' dog barking a few houses down, and the distant murmur of a television from the Garcia's place next door. But inside my house, there was only a profound silence, and the crushing weight of a betrayal I was still struggling to comprehend. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 8 times. Richard had inherited that clock from his father, and it had kept perfect time for over 40 years. It was reliable, steady, trustworthy, everything Mark, it seemed, was not. I closed my eyes and let my head fall back against the chair's headrest. Tomorrow, I would need to think clearly and decide what this ugly confrontation meant for my future. But tonight, I just sat with the searing pain of discovering that the son I had loved unconditionally saw me as nothing more than an obstacle standing between him and his inheritance. The old house creaked around me as it settled into the night. The following morning passed in a quiet haze. I made my usual breakfast, a poached egg, a slice of wheat toast, black coffee, and read the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette from front to back. The familiar routine helped to steady my nerves after the previous day's explosion. I even managed to spend some time in my small herb garden on the back patio, checking on the early spring shoots that were just beginning to push through the soil. Now, I sat at my kitchen table with my afternoon coffee and a crossword puzzle, desperately trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. The house felt peaceful again, the way it was supposed to. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains Richard had hung years ago, casting gentle, dancing patterns across the oak table. When the phone rang, I glanced at the caller ID and felt my stomach clench into a tight knot. Mark. I let it ring twice more, my hand hovering uncertainly over the receiver. Part of me wanted to let it go to voicemail, to maintain the firm boundary I had drawn last night, but another part, the part that had been his mother for 42 years, simply couldn't ignore the call. Hello, Mom. I want to apologize for yesterday. I was so wrong. His voice was different, softer, more contrite than I had heard in years. I sat up straighter in my chair, my grip tightening on the phone. Mark, what's happened? You never apologize. There was a pause. When he spoke again, his tone was laced with what sounded like genuine shame. I realized I was acting like a monster. The things I said about you passing away, about the house. Mom, I am so deeply ashamed of myself. I stared out the kitchen window at Mrs. Henderson's vibrant rose bushes, trying to process this sudden dramatic change. In all the years since Mark had become an adult, I could count on one hand the number of times he'd admitted to being wrong about anything. I don't know, son. You said some truly terrible things. I know I did. His voice cracked slightly. I've been under so much pressure lately, but that's no excuse. You didn't deserve any of what I put you through. Can we please talk over dinner? Please? My free hand drummed a nervous rhythm against the tabletop. This felt wrong somehow, too convenient, too perfectly timed, but it was also exactly what I had hoped for during those long, lonely hours last night. Some sign that my son still had a conscience buried somewhere beneath all that desperation. Mark, please, give me a chance to make it right. The Gilded Sparrow, tonight at 7. My treat. Let me show you that I can still be the son you raised me to be. The Gilded Sparrow. Mark knew it was my favorite restaurant. The place Richard and I had celebrated every anniversary for the last 10 years of his life. He was pulling at every emotional string he could find, but maybe that meant something. Maybe it meant he remembered what was important to me. That some part of him still cared about making things right between us. I looked around my quiet kitchen, at the empty chair across from me where Richard used to sit for our afternoon conversations. The loneliness I usually managed to keep at bay came rushing back in a tidal wave, the reality of eating every meal alone. Of having no one to share the small, simple moments of each day. All right, I heard myself saying. But this is your last chance, Mark. Thank you, Mom. Thank you so much. 7 o'clock at the Gilded Sparrow. I promise you won't regret this. After I hung up, I remained at the kitchen table for a long time. The crossword puzzle lay unfinished beside my now cold coffee. Outside, the afternoon sun continued its slow, graceful arc across the sky. But something had shifted in the quiet rhythm of my day. I wanted to believe Mark's apology was genuine. I wanted to believe that yesterday had been his rock bottom, and that he was ready to climb back up to being the man I had tried so hard to raise. But there was a small, persistent voice in the back of my mind whispering warnings I wasn't quite ready to hear. I stood up and walked to the calendar hanging on the refrigerator. Tuesday, March 11th. I circled the date with a red pen, though I wasn't entirely sure why. Maybe it was because I sensed, deep down, that this dinner would be a turning point, one way or another. 4.5 hours. Until I would learn whether my son had truly found his way back to me, or if this was just another, more insidious kind of betrayal I hadn't yet imagined. I set down the pen, and headed upstairs to get ready, my footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. Despite Mr. Peterson's lack of detail, Mark's apology had sounded so sincere, more sincere than anything I had heard from him in years. Maybe people really could change. Maybe yesterday had truly been his rock bottom. Standing before the bathroom mirror, I studied my reflection. The woman looking back at me seemed older than I remembered. Her face more weathered by the recent emotional storm. A faint dusting of gray stubble I hadn't even bothered to properly pluck my eyebrows made me look tired and defeated. Tonight called for better than that. I carefully applied my moisturizer, working it into my skin. The familiar routine felt meditative, purposeful. This dinner mattered. If Mark was truly ready to apologize, to make amends for yesterday's cruelty, then I owed it to our relationship, to the memory of his father, to meet him halfway. Moving to my bedroom closet, I considered my options. The navy blue dress hung next to a charcoal gray one, both neatly pressed. I chose the navy. Richard had always said it brought out the blue in my eyes, made me look distinguished rather than just old. If we were truly starting fresh, I wanted to look my best. The ritual of dressing felt almost ceremonial. A simple white blouse, crisp and clean. As I fastened my favorite pearl necklace, I caught sight of Richard's old valet box on the dresser. He'd kept my favorite earrings in there, the silver ones his parents had given me for our wedding. I put them on. I considered 2 scarves, one burgundy and one a soft blue. The burgundy matched my handbag, but the blue had always been Richard's preference. "It makes you look trustworthy, Ellie," he'd always said. Tonight, I chose trust. I chose the blue. At my vanity, I opened the small bottle of perfume he'd given me for our 25th anniversary. The scent of gardenias instantly transported me. Christmas morning. 1982. Richard laughing as I tried to act surprised by the gift I'd seen him wrap 3 days earlier. "For special occasions," he'd said, kissing my cheek. Tonight felt special, in its own complicated way. I applied the perfume sparingly to my wrists and neck. Richard would be happy to see us together again. He had always believed in second chances, in the possibility of redemption. "People make mistakes, Eleanor," he used to say, after particularly difficult days with a teenage Mark. "What matters is whether they learn from them." My wallet sat on the nightstand, thicker than usual with the pension check I'd cashed yesterday. I counted the bills more than enough for dinner at the Gilded Sparrow, even if I insisted on paying despite Mark's offer. Old habits die hard. And I'd been picking up checks for my children their entire lives. Keys in hand, I checked my reflection one final time. The woman in the mirror looked presentable, dignified, and ready to give her son another chance. Maybe I had judged Mark too harshly. People can change. Tonight would be a fresh start for our family. Walking toward the bedroom door, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before Richard's death. Hope, real, genuine hope that our family might finally heal, that the harsh words of yesterday could be forgiven and forgotten. Mark was still my son, regardless of his mistakes, and sons, I reasoned, deserved the benefit of the doubt from their mothers. I reached for the light switch, ready to head downstairs and drive to what I prayed would be our reconciliation. I was reaching for my coat, which was hanging by the front door, when my phone buzzed in my purse. The sound cut through my optimistic mood like a knife. I almost ignored it. Whatever message it was could wait until after dinner. But something made me pause, my hand halfway to the coat sleeve. The notification was a text from Mr. Peterson. "Call me urgently." My fingers suddenly felt clumsy as I dialed his number. Mr. Peterson never used exclamation points, never sent urgent messages unless something was seriously wrong. The phone rang once, twice, and then his familiar, calm voice answered. "Mr. Peterson, What's happened? Why the urgent message? Eleanor, your son Mark called my office today. He was asking about your will. The words hit me like a splash of ice water. I leaned against the hallway wall for support. The blue scarf I had so carefully chosen, suddenly feeling too tight around my neck. What? What exactly did he want to know? He asked if all of your property goes directly to him, or if there's a share for your daughter, Sarah. Mr. Peterson paused, and I could almost hear him choosing his next words carefully. Then, Eleanor. Then he inquired about the process of contesting the will. Contest it? But why would he? My voice sounded strange in my own ears, hollow and distant. Through the front window, I could see the Hendersons walking their golden retriever, the same evening routine they'd followed for 15 years. Everything outside looked so normal, so peaceful, while my world was tilting violently on its axis. Eleanor, I suspect Mark is planning something deceitful. Please, be careful tonight. I pressed my free hand against the wall for support. The gardenia perfume Richard had given me suddenly smelled cloying, too strong. Mr. Peterson? Are you sure? Maybe he just wanted to understand his rights. He asked specifically about the requirements for mental competency, Eleanor. About what would happen if someone were to claim you weren't of sound mind when you signed the documents. Sound mind. The phrase echoed in my head as the horrifying pieces began to fall into place. Yesterday's explosive demand for money. Today's sudden, convenient apology. The dinner invitation to a very public place, where witnesses could observe my behavior. My reflection stared back at me from the hallway mirror. An old woman in a blue scarf, dressed for a dinner with her son, who might be planning to have her declared legally incompetent. The hope I'd carried downstairs evaporated instantly, replaced by something cold and hard. What should I do? I asked, though a part of me already knew the answer. Don't go, stay home. Let me handle this from a legal standpoint. But even as Mr. Peterson spoke, I was shaking my head. Mark thought he could manipulate me. He thought I was just another weak old woman, ready to be pushed aside. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. No, I said, my voice firm now. I'm going to dinner. But I won't eat or drink a single thing until I know exactly what he's planning. Eleanor, please. I've handled worse than my own son, Mr. Peterson. But thank you for warning me. After hanging up, I stood in the hallway for a long moment, studying my reflection. The woman looking back at me was no longer hopeful or naive. This was the Eleanor who'd built a life from scratch with her husband, who'd raised 2 children, who'd buried the love of her life and kept going. Mark wanted to play games with his father's legacy and my life's work. Fine. But he was about to find out he was playing against the wrong opponent. Maybe Mr. Peterson is wrong. Maybe Mark just wanted to understand his inheritance rights. The traffic light turned green and I accelerated slowly, staying in the right lane. A young woman in a flashy red sports car sped past me, probably thinking I was just another overly cautious old driver. She wasn't wrong. But tonight, my caution had an entirely different purpose. No, after yesterday's fight, this all makes a terrible kind of sense. But I just can't believe my son would. Another red light. A man stood at the corner holding a cardboard sign, and I found myself wondering what series of events had led him to this intersection. Bad decisions? Bad luck? Family betrayal? I reached into my wallet and handed him a $5 bill when he approached my window. He thanked me with a genuine warmth in his eyes before moving on to the next car. At least, someone would benefit from my evening preparations. I continued driving, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. The familiar landmarks of Pittsburgh passed by. The convenience store where I bought my morning paper. The pharmacy where I picked up my heart medication. The salon where I'd been getting my hair done for 30 years. This was my city, my life, my routine. And Mark thought he could just swoop in and claim it all. I'll be careful. I won't eat or drink anything until I'm absolutely sure of his intentions. The decision felt solid, logical. Mark might be planning something devious, but he was dealing with a woman who had spent her career meticulously balancing accounts and spotting discrepancies. I could handle whatever scheme my son had devised. As I turned onto East Carson Street, the distinctive sign for the Gilded Sparrow came into view. The restaurant was housed in a beautifully converted old church, its Gothic architecture both stunning and, in the gathering dusk, somehow ominous. Richard and I had celebrated so many anniversaries there, back when I believed family was something sacred and permanent. Traffic slowed as I approached the bustling restaurant district. Office workers were heading home, couples were arriving for dinner dates, and families were gathering for Tuesday evening meals. They were all normal people, doing normal things, completely unaware that somewhere among them, a mother was driving to confront her son's ultimate betrayal. I signaled for the turn into the restaurant's parking lot, my pulse surprisingly steady despite everything. Whatever Mark had planned, whatever trap he thought he was setting, I would be ready. The naive mother who had dressed so hopefully in her bedroom mirror was gone. In her place sat a woman who had learned, perhaps far too late, that trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. But I would still be his mother, even if he had forgotten how to be my son. I parked in the restaurant's lot and sat for a moment, watching other diners walk toward the entrance. Normal families, normal couples, people who didn't suspect their loved ones might be plotting against them. The Gothic architecture of the converted church looked warm and welcoming in the soft evening light, its stained glass windows glowing like jewels. Mark and Jessica were waiting just inside the entrance, their faces lighting up with what appeared to be genuine joy when they saw me. Mark rushed forward with his arms open, pulling me into an embrace that felt completely different from his aggressive, menacing posture just the day before. "Mom, I'm so glad you came. I've been thinking about our relationship all day." Jessica joined us, her smile radiant as she took my arm. "Eleanor, you look fantastic. Mark told me how much he regrets yesterday." Their enthusiasm felt overwhelming, almost theatrical. But standing there in their warm embrace, surrounded by the gentle murmur of other diners, and the soft classical music playing in the background, Mr. Peterson's warnings began to seem paranoid and distant. "I just want things to be good between us, son." Mark guided us to a window table he had apparently reserved, one with a breathtaking view of the downtown Pittsburgh skyline twinkling in the gathering darkness. Jessica helped me with my chair, fussing over my comfort in a way she never had before. A waitress appeared almost immediately, as if on cue. "We took the liberty of ordering some wine," Mark announced, gesturing to a bottle of Cabernet that was already breathing on the table. "Your favorite vintage, from when Dad was alive." Emily filled my glass with a practiced grace, her movement smooth and deliberate. "This will be perfect for our reconciliation toast." I raised my glass, feeling genuinely touched by their attention to detail. They had remembered Richard's favorite wine and chosen our old anniversary table by the window. Maybe I had been too quick to judge Mark's motives. "To family," Mark said solemnly, his eyes meeting mine. "To second chances, and to forgiveness," Jessica added, her voice warm with what seemed like utter sincerity. The wine tasted exactly as I remembered, rich, smooth, with hints of cherry and oak that Richard had always been able to identify for me. As we talked, Mark seemed like his old self. The son who had once helped me plant a tree in our backyard. The one who had called me every single week during his college years. When the appetizers arrived, Jessica pushed the bruschetta toward me. "Mark said this was your favorite here. The tomatoes are from the chef's own garden." Course after course appeared, each dish seemingly chosen with my specific preferences in mind. Mark carved the prime rib himself, placing the choicest cuts on my plate. Jessica kept my wine glass meticulously filled, attentive to my every move. "Try this steak, Mom," Mark urged. "The chef is a friend of mine. He prepared it specially for you." The meat was perfectly seasoned, so tender, it could be cut with a fork. Mark watched me eat with a look of satisfaction, his face glowing with what looked like a strange, reversed paternal pride. "And this sauce is absolutely incredible. It's the restaurant's secret recipe," Jessica added, spooning more of the rich, herb-laden sauce over my food. Throughout the meal, they shared memories I had almost forgotten: family vacations to the shore, Christmas mornings, little moments when Mark had been the loving son I'd always believed him to be. Jessica told stories about their marriage, their hopes for having children, and their desire to be closer to me in my later years. By the time dessert arrived, the wine and their disarming warmth had completely dissolved my earlier suspicions. This was my family, flawed, certainly, but loving, and trying to heal the wounds we had inflicted on each other. Mr. Playson and Ever. Peterson's warnings now seemed like the paranoid concerns of a man who dealt with too many bitter divorces and ugly family disputes. Mark paid the check with a flourish, waving away my attempts to contribute. "Tonight is my treat, Mom. It's my apology." Walking to the parking lot, I felt lighter than I had in months. The cool March air was crisp and clean, carrying the promise of spring. Mark and Jessica hugged me goodbye with what felt like genuine, heartfelt affection. "Let's do this again soon," Mark said, his hand warm and reassuring on my shoulder. I drove home with the windows down, humming along to an oldies station on the radio. The drive was pleasant, filled with thoughts of reconciliation and a renewed hope for our family's future. I even stopped at the corner market to buy Mark's favorite coffee, thinking I might invite him over for breakfast later in the week. The house felt warm and welcoming when I returned, no longer the fortress I had retreated to after Monday's confrontation. I settled into my reading chair with the evening news, feeling more content than I had at any point since Richard's passing. The wine from dinner had left me feeling relaxed, almost drowsy. Around 10 o'clock, I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and considered calling Mr. Peterson to tell him his concerns had been entirely unfounded. That's when the first wave of nausea hit. It started as a mild queasiness, the kind you might blame on eating too rich a meal too quickly. I had certainly indulged more than usual tonight, but within minutes, the discomfort escalated into sharp, cramping pains that doubled me over in my chair. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. I stumbled to the kitchen sink, as a bitter bile rose in my throat, my legs suddenly unsteady beneath me. The cramping intensified, sending lightning bolts of agony through my abdomen. This wasn't indigestion from too much prime rib. The vomiting started without warning, violent, racking heaves that left me gasping and shaking. Between spasms, my mind raced backward through the evening, the wine Mark had chosen, Jessica's insistence that I try everything, the special sauce she had kept spooning onto my plate. Mr. Peterson's warning echoed in my head. "I suspect Mark is planning something deceitful." My hands trembled as I reached for the kitchen phone, each movement requiring an enormous effort. The numbers on the keypad blurred as another wave of nausea crashed over me. I could barely hold the receiver steady. 911, what's your emergency? Hello, emergency services. I'm very sick. I think I've been poisoned. The address is 1247 Oakwood Avenue. Ma'am, stay on the line. What are your symptoms? Severe stomach pain, vomiting, dizziness. I ate dinner out tonight. Another spasm cut off my words. Ma'am, can you stay conscious? A crew is already on its way to you. The dispatcher's voice seemed to be coming from very far away. I slumped against the kitchen counter, the phone sliding from my sweaty grip. Through the haze of pain, one thought burned with terrifying clarity. My son had tried to murder me. The sound of sirens grew louder and closer. Red and blue lights flashed through my front windows, painting the familiar walls in the jarring colors of an emergency. Heavy footsteps approached the door. Mrs. Lane, Pittsburgh Fire and EMS, we're coming in. A paramedic appeared at my side. A young woman with kind eyes and steady, capable hands. She checked my pulse, shined a light in my eyes, and asked questions I could barely answer. "Mrs. Lane, can you hear me? We're taking you to the hospital." As they lifted me onto the stretcher, I caught sight of my reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back was pale, her face a mask of pain, having aged years in a single evening. But beneath the physical distress, her eyes burned with something harder than pain. It was understanding. The ambulance pulled away from Oakwood Avenue, carrying me toward UPMC Presbyterian Hospital and away from the home where I had lived in innocent trust of my family for far too long. Consciousness returned gradually, accompanied by the steady, rhythmic beeping of monitors and the sterile antiseptic smell that defines hospital existence. Sunlight filtered through the Venetian blinds, casting narrow strips of light across the starched white sheets. My mouth felt cotton dry, and an IV line snaked from my left arm to a bag of clear fluid hanging beside the bed. I tried to sit up, but a profound weakness kept me horizontal. The events of last night rushed back with brutal clarity. The dinner, the sickness, the ambulance, the betrayal that had nearly killed me. "Mrs. Lane, you're awake." A woman in a white coat entered my room carrying a tablet. She wore the serious expression doctors reserve for delivering difficult news. She was perhaps in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back neatly, and intelligent dark eyes that suggested both competence and compassion. "How are you feeling? You were brought in critical condition last night." "What happened to me, doctor?" "I'm Dr. Chen, your attending physician. We've been running tests all night." She pulled a chair close to the bed, sitting down with the deliberate movements of someone preparing for a difficult conversation. "The tests show the presence of a foreign substance in your bloodstream. Ricin. It's a plant-based poison derived from castor beans." The word hit me like a punch to the gut. Ricin. Not some accidental food poisoning or a sudden illness. A deliberate, calculated attempt at murder. But where could I have? The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity. "Oh God, my son. That scoundrel tried to kill me." Dr. Chen's eyebrows rose slightly. "Mrs. Lane, if you suspect this was intentional poisoning, you need to contact the police immediately. This is a criminal matter." Ricin. I had read about it in scientific journals years ago, case studies of industrial accidents. Highly toxic, difficult to detect, and nearly impossible to treat once symptoms appeared. Mark had done his research. "How bad is it, doctor?" "You were very fortunate. The amount in your system suggests someone wanted to make you gravely ill, possibly fatally so. But because you received treatment so quickly, your prognosis is good. With supportive care, most ricin poisoning victims recover fully." Most victims. The words carried the ominous implication of the minority who didn't survive. Dr. Chen continued with clinical precision. "Ricin typically takes several hours for symptoms to manifest, which matches your timeline. The initial treatment involves removing the poison from your system and managing the symptoms. Unfortunately, there's no specific antidote." I closed my eyes, trying to process the sheer magnitude of Mark's betrayal. Yesterday, I had been a mother hoping for reconciliation with her troubled son. Today, I was a murder victim who had survived only by sheer luck and quick medical intervention. "The police will need to collect evidence," she said gently. "Your medical records? Details about where and when you believe the exposure occurred. Evidence. The restaurant. The specially prepared meal. Mark's insistence that I try everything. Jessica's careful attention to my wine glass. Their perfectly coordinated performance of a loving family, welcoming their matriarch back into the fold. How long before I can leave?" "Another day or two, for observation. We need to monitor your kidney function and ensure all traces of the toxin are eliminated from your system." After Dr. Chen left, I stared at the sterile ceiling tiles and contemplated my new reality. My son, the boy I had taught to throw a baseball, whose college education I had funded, whose wedding I had helped pay for, had tried to murder me for my inheritance. The family I had grieved for and hoped to reconcile with no longer existed. In its place stood two cold-blooded killers who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to their financial security. Mark thought he was dealing with a helpless old woman. He was about to discover just how wrong he could be. The taxi dropped me off at the Pittsburgh Bureau of Police headquarters. Dr. Chen's discharge papers and my medical records sat in a manila envelope tucked securely under my arm, evidence that would put my son behind bars, where he belonged. The fluorescent lights in the lobby buzzed overhead as I approached the front desk, where a uniformed officer looked up from his computer screen. "I need to report an attempted murder," I said, my voice steady despite the colossal weight of the words. Within 15 minutes, I was seated across from a Detective Miller in a small, sterile interview room that smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. She was a woman in her mid-40s with sharp, intelligent eyes that had clearly seen enough family violence to take my case seriously from the very start. "Mrs. Lane, please tell me everything that happened in detail." I spread the hospital documents across the scratched metal table between us. The toxicology report showed ricin levels that could have easily killed someone frailer, or someone who hadn't received treatment as quickly as I had. My son, Mark, invited me to dinner after a major fight we'd had on Monday. Now I understand it was all just a trap. Detective Miller studied the medical records, making careful notes in a leather-bound pad. Her expression remained professional, but I could see the concern growing in her eyes as she absorbed the horrifying details of what Mark had done. "Are you certain the poisoning occurred at the restaurant?" "Absolutely. Mark insisted I eat a specific dish and drink that particular wine. His wife, Jessica, kept refilling my glass and pushing different foods toward me all evening." I walked her through the entire sequence of events. Monday's explosive confrontation, Mr. Pless, Peterson's warning about Mark's suspicious legal inquiries, Tuesday's manipulative dinner invitation, and the carefully orchestrated meal that had nearly ended my life. "The ricin was probably in the sauce," I explained, remembering Jessica's insistence that I try more of the special preparation. "And the wine. They worked together. They made sure I consumed enough to do the job." Detective Miller leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against the notepad. "Mrs. Lane, this appears to be a clear-cut case of attempted murder with premeditation. We'll need to bring your son and his wife in for questioning." The word sent a surge of cold satisfaction through me. Justice. Finally. Justice. Mark has been desperate for money. He's drowning in debt from some bad cryptocurrency investments. He called my lawyer asking about my will, specifically about how to contest it if I were to be declared mentally incompetent. "That establishes a clear motive," Detective Miller said, making another note. "Along with the medical evidence and your testimony, we have more than enough grounds for an immediate arrest." She explained the process. Arrest warrants would be issued within hours, Mark and Jessica would be taken into custody, and a prosecutor would review the case for formal charges. As the primary witness, I would need to testify at the trial if it proceeded that far. "Detective," I said, my voice hard as steel. "They thought they were dealing with a helpless old woman they could manipulate and then murder. They miscalculated." By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Detective Miller had recorded my complete statement and logged all the medical evidence. She walked me to the lobby, shaking my hand firmly at the door. "Mrs. Lane, we take attempted murder very seriously, especially when it involves family members targeting elderly relatives. Your son and daughter-in-law will be in custody by tonight." I walked out of the police station into the late afternoon sunlight, feeling lighter than I had since before Richard's death. The gears of the legal machine were now in motion, grinding slowly but surely toward the justice Mark thought he could so cleverly avoid. 2 days had passed since Mark and Jessica were arrested at their suburban home, led away in handcuffs, while their neighbors watched from behind curtained windows. The local news had picked up the story, "Son attempts to poison mother for inheritance." And my phone had been ringing constantly with calls from reporters and distant relatives, all expressing their profound shock. I ignored them all. Today, I had business to finish. Mr. Peterson's law office occupied the second floor of a stately brick building downtown, its walls lined with legal volumes and framed certificates that spoke of decades of practice. He had been my lawyer for 15 years, handling Richard's estate and my own retirement planning. Today, he would help me rewrite the future. Eleanor, are you absolutely certain you want to completely exclude Mark from the will? I sat across from him at the polished mahogany conference table where we had signed so many documents over the years. The new will lay open between us, its pages crisp with the legal language that would strip Mark of every single cent he had expected to inherit. Absolutely. A person who tried to kill me doesn't deserve a penny, let alone a legacy. Mr. Peterson adjusted his reading glasses, reviewing the document one final time. We had spent an hour going through every asset, every bank account, every possession I owned. The house on Oakwood Avenue, the retirement savings Richard and I had painstakingly accumulated over 40 years, the life insurance policies, the pension benefits, everything would now go to Sarah. The entire house. The savings, the pension funds, everything goes to Sarah? That's right. Sarah has always been a good and loving daughter. My mind went to my daughter, who taught 3rd grade at a local elementary school and had never asked me for anything beyond birthday gifts for her children. She didn't even know about Mark's arrest yet. I had decided to wait until after the trial to explain everything. The shock would be devastating enough, without the added burden of suddenly becoming wealthy. Mr. 8. Peterson leaned back in his leather chair, studying me with the careful attention he always gave to important matters. Mark might try to contest this will in court. Let him try. I have irrefutable evidence of his crime. The attempted murder charge would be Mark's biggest obstacle in any legal challenge. No court in the country would award an inheritance to someone who tried to kill the testator for that very money. The medical evidence alone would destroy any contest he might dare to file. Will include specific language referencing the criminal charges, Mr. Peterson explained, making notes in the margins. That way, even if he were to be acquitted on some bizarre technicality, the will explicitly states your reasons for the disinheritance. I watched him work, remembering all the times he had helped our family navigate legal complexities. He had handled Richard's medical directives during his final illness, helped us set up educational trusts for our grandchildren, and guided us through tax planning that had preserved our modest wealth. Now, he was helping me ensure that wealth went to someone who truly deserved it. The signing ceremony took place at 2 o'clock. With Mr. Peterson's secretary and paralegal serving as witnesses, I read through every page of the new will, confirming that Mark Lane was mentioned only to be explicitly and permanently excluded from any inheritance whatsoever. My signature felt different this time, not the shaky hand of an old woman making routine legal updates, but the firm, decisive declaration of someone taking absolute control of her legacy. The notary's seal made it official. Mark would get nothing. The will is now legally binding, Mr. Peterson said as we shook hands. Mark's attempted murder has cost him everything he thought he would inherit. Walking to my car, I felt the grim satisfaction of a woman who had outmaneuvered her would-be killer. Mark had gambled his inheritance on one deadly dinner, and in doing so, he had lost it all. The month since changing my will had passed in a blur of legal preparations. Mark and Emily had been denied bail, a significant flight risk. The judge had determined so. They'd spent the weeks leading up to the trial in the county lockup. Mr. Peterson and I had met repeatedly with the prosecutor, reviewing evidence and preparing for what promised to be a straightforward case. This morning, my daughter Sarah sat beside me in the courthouse hallway, her face still pale with the shock of learning about her brother's crime. I had told her everything 3 days ago, including her new status as my sole heir. She had cried for an hour straight, grieving the brother she thought she knew. "Mom, I still can't believe Mark would do something so horrible," she whispered as we waited for our case to be called. People change, sweetheart. Sometimes they become strangers wearing familiar faces. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected, with worn wooden benches and harsh fluorescent lighting that cast stark shadows across the proceedings. A handful of spectators filled the gallery, mostly reporters and curious court watchers drawn by the sensational nature of the case. Mark and Jessica sat at the defendant's table with their court-appointed lawyers, both looking haggard and worn down from their month in custody. Mark had lost a significant amount of weight, and his expensive suit hung loosely on his diminished frame. Jessica kept her head bowed, avoiding eye contact with everyone. "Mrs. Lane, please tell the court about the events of March 11th. The prosecutor, a sharp and competent woman in her 30s, named Jennifer Walsh, guided me through my testimony with practiced efficiency. I recounted the entire, horrifying sequence. Mark's desperate demands for money, his manipulative dinner invitation, and the poisoning that had nearly claimed my life. Your Honor, my son invited me to dinner with the sole intention of poisoning me for my inheritance. In the witness box, I felt calm and focused. This was my moment to ensure justice was served, to make certain that Mark's heinous crime received the punishment it deserved. The jury listened intently as I described the ricin poisoning, the hospitalization, and the gut-wrenching realization that my own son had tried to murder me. Tests confirmed the presence of ricin in the victim's system, the prosecutor announced, presenting Dr. Chen's detailed medical reports to the jury. Mark's lawyer attempted a flimsy defense of accidental poisoning, some far-fetched story about contaminated ingredients at the restaurant. But the evidence was simply overwhelming. Mark's inquiries about my will, his severe financial desperation, the coordinated behavior at dinner, and Jessica's careful attention to my food and drink. When the jury returned after just 2 hours of deliberation, their faces were grim and resolute. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, we the jury find the defendant, Mark Lane, guilty. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, we the jury find the defendant, Jessica Lane, guilty. Mark's composure finally cracked. "Mom, I didn't mean it. It was an accident." I looked at him across the courtroom, at this stranger who had once been my son. "An accident? You called my lawyer about my will the day before you poisoned me, Mark." The judge sentenced them each to 15 years in a state prison, with the possibility of parole after 10. Mark would be 77 years old when he got out, if he lived that long. Jessica would be 65. Their lives were effectively over, their futures destroyed by their own insatiable greed. Sarah and I walked out of the courthouse together, leaving Mark and Jessica to begin their journey to prison. The warm April sun felt wonderful on my face, promising renewal and fresh beginnings. "What happens now, Mom?" Sarah asked, her voice soft. "Now we live, sweetheart. We live with integrity, the way your father would have wanted." Justice had been served. My family's betrayer would spend the rest of his productive years behind bars, while my loyal, loving daughter would inherit everything I had worked my entire life to build. The moral order had been restored, and I could finally rest easy, knowing that the right person would carry on our family's legacy. Mark had gambled everything on one poisonous meal. In the end, he had lost far more than just my inheritance. He had lost his freedom, his future, and any claim he ever had to being called my son.